All right. Looks like we're recording. Before we kind of dive into the regular conversation, I was looking at, Stephen, was that you that posted that on the, is it random? The thing about the marketplace for truth?
Oh yeah, it's an article I read in Communications of ACM, and it seemed very interesting. I mean, it's like, yeah. Did you read the full article?
Yeah, I just finished the whole thing. Yeah, I found it interesting. That implementation test definitely requires like help from government and the organizations that are involved and everything. It's a good idea. It's kind of hard to implement. But what it made me think of is I wonder if, and I know many of us on this call aren't in the systems that actually produce well, I guess either way. It'd be interesting to see if people would just do a simple betting on facts, which I know people have, what is it? I can't remember the term, but they do have like the prediction markets, right? So it's kind of a thing of that, except it's like past. Can we predict the past? Prediction is hard. Predicting the future is even harder, right?
Yeah, I also had to think of prediction markets, but it's essentially different in the sense that the person putting out the advertisement is paying for the prediction, not people. Well, not external people.
Yeah, it's definitely a different idea. It just spurned in my idea to see if I could throw up a site where people could bet on facts and then have researchers do the research. And so it's kind of like a PolitiFact, except it's public and it's funded by people.
Doesn't that exist?
I don't think with the public funding and without a argument tree.
No, there's no. Not with an argument tree, I agree with that, but there is betting on facts, betting on situations.
So there's prediction markets.
Prediction markets, they exist, yes.
Right, so that's all, I think those are exclusively future.
So
this would just be the exact same thing and just be things in the past. See if can we predict the past? That's the question.
I've seen this model proposed a lot.
Lots of times,
yeah, and specifically, they brought it up for the canonical debate. It's just like an incentives marketplace for. It doesn't have to be for facts if something's true, but if something is useful, sort of you get payback based on how many upvotes your contribution is. It can be used for anything, right? It can just be Reddit style. You get tokens or whatever for upvotes. But they've also proposed it for arguments where if it's a good argument,
Felix has done a lot of work on voting, by the way.
Right. That's yeah.
The difference, Tim, would be it'd be interesting if people who believe each side could put money into a kit and then the side that loses pays the other.
I just, it's against the canonical debate principle, right?
Yeah,
because you got to declare a winner to pay out.
Well, that's why I prefaced it with some of us don't like having a winner. I am not opposed to that.
I think it could just well run on top of something like canonical debate. Look at it more as an application again. That's why I posted it, because it was highly relevant, I think. Because some of the things that were missing was exactly like a more transparency, open discussion in terms of who decides what is true or false. And I think an argument tree could help with that.
Yeah. Anyways, that's a distraction from the main topic. So where were we from last call? Did anyone do any homework? I think some people had some homework.
I did, but I did not complete it, but I did enough to have a few new points for discussion.
Excellent.
So I don't know whether you had a chance to look at the Google Docs document I shared in the glossary channel, I believe.
Oh, I missed that somehow. I saw you made a comment. I probably just accidentally swiped away. Oh yeah, on my phone I just saw that summary bit. I did read your summary. So let's see if anyone else did.
So yeah, to reiterate, the original exercise there was to break down one of the potential conclusions of a prisoner's dilemma. In this specific case, I have to look.
And feel free to share your screen if you want to. Yeah, I guess I don't really understand your summary number one, but number two I find kind of more interesting to discuss.
I also have to reread it for a second. This is
Sure.
some time ago. But yeah, just to reiterate, which I said before, but I was muted, I noticed. The thing I tried to do here was to decompose one of the potential conclusions of the prisoner's dilemma into micro-arguments. So that was the assigned homework, if you will. And as I said before, I didn't complete that entirely, but I ended up on some insights that I think are worthwhile to talk about now. So I will try to go over this as I recall it. So the conclusion being discussed here is whether Dave and Henry will receive a different sentence. And there are two situations leading up to that, either if only Dave testifies or if only Henry testifies. For the specifics, you can read the full situation there. But I think that is very much in line with the original intent of Marc-Antoine in his example.
You're muted, Marc-Antoine. Saw you nodding though.
Could you confirm that, Marc-Antoine, just so we're sure we're on the same page?
Yep. Technical difficulties.
Sorry, yeah, I'm fighting with my screens right now. Yes, I confirm that the basic situation is as I envisioned it. I'm trying to understand the rest of your argument, and speed reading is not working well. I'm mostly trying to understand what does it mean for micro 2 to be indented under micro 1? What kind of dependency does that entail?
Okay, I wasn't that far yet. I just first want to verify that we're arguing for Dave and Henry. They will receive a different sentence, which can happen in two cases when either only Henry testifies or only Dave testifies.
Yeah.
Okay. Now to immediately answer your question, what does it mean that it's indented? It's just for easier representation. It's actually the full micro argument stated would be Henry will not testify against Dave supports, Dave will testify against Henry supports Dave, and Henry will receive a different sentence. So this is an argument that is being supported by this.
Okay. You're making the micro argument support. I see what you're doing. Yeah, that makes sense.
So we agreed that micro 1 in itself is a claim, wrong. Right? So yeah. This micro argument is a claim. Micro 2 is basically this claim supporting the claim as an entirety of micro 1.
Yeah.
And that's, in short, that's what I usually use to describe that. I use it because in the case of this example, this works two ways. And the main insight there is basically that In the case of multi-premise arguments we've been talking about so far, you can argue either way. One microargument supporting the other. One claim supporting one microargument, and then the other. Yeah, it's hard to explain.
No, but now I do get it. You'd need actually, those are 2 rows, right? To get the 4 rows, you will need 8 microarguments.
I think you need to clarify what do you mean by row here.
One situation, if you will. There's the, well, the row in the truth table, right? I mean, there's Dave testifies, Henry does not. Dave testify, Henry does. Dave does not, Henry does. Dave does not, Henry does not. So, these are each a row.
This only considers one of the claims, each of the claims to be true or false. There's no different like conditions where they're true or false.
Yeah. What I'm saying, okay, fair. So there's.
That's what I mean by consider that only Dave testifies.
Yeah, that's what I mean by saying you're only taking 2 rows.
Yes, yes, in that sense, yes.
Dave will testify. And
yeah, there would be indeed 4 more of these micro-arguments if you want to argue, consider that only Henry testifies. Then there would be 4 similar micro-arguments.
Sorry, 1 second. I'm being distracted by about today's insane. I have about 5 conversations going. Sorry. Notifications galore. I just need to. Okay. Sorry, I'm thinking. Henry will not testify against Dave. I'm a bit surprised that in the first one, you put Dave at the top instead of saying Dave will not testify against Henry, opposes Dave and Henry will receive different sentences, then supported by Dave.
But that Dave testifies. So
no, but
the point is, if you're arguing for something, in this case, you're arguing from the assumption that Dave testifies and Henry doesn't.
Yeah, that's true. That's not the same too. Fair enough. But couldn't you still say it? Dave will testify against Henry, opposes Dave and Henry will receive a different sentence, with then next step is because Henry will testify against Dave, supports that.
You have different ways of formulating it. Yeah, you can also put, I mean, that's the whole relation between support and opposing the negation.
Yeah, and by the way, this is why I was saying, oh, let's make sure to avoid order dependency. And this is really what's happening here. There's not only 8 statements for the full table, but there's actually 16 ways to put those statements. Or I mean, 16 statements that could make the 4 tables, because you can order them in 2 different ways.
No, because I think, well, we still need to talk about that, but I'm fairly certain we agreed that X supports Y is the same as X opposes not Y.
No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about you can put here. Let's call micro 1 and micro 3 the inner arguments, and micro 2 and micro 4 the outer arguments. Mm-hmm. And what I'm saying is you can change Henry being inner and Dave being the outer versus Henry being the inner and Dave being the outer, and make the exact same claim. So there's each of those claims has 2 forms. Like the micro 1, micro 2 pair could be expressed as.
But that's exactly what happens. Like here, Henry is the inner one, and here it's the outer one.
Oh yeah.
So here's my understanding of that, and why I don't think it
So
works.
that's only one row, really. That's one row of the truth table.
Yeah. Like, the way I see it, you're saying that, like, basically you would structure it as having a micro-argument supporting some claim, and the second micro-argument supporting that micro-argument, and that's how you would do the... But the problem is that the first micro-argument on its own does not stand as something you could draw a conclusion from. Like, it doesn't stand as a relevant argument. You absolutely require micro 2 in order to complete the argument, which means that you can't really consider it to be a micro argument. Right?
We've had the discussion many times, right? There will always be implicit claims that are absolutely required for the argument to work. So this is a suggestion how to gradually build up multi-premise arguments. So I agree with you, but I don't see that as a problem. This is more of a suggestion. How can you, starting from more granular building blocks, find proximity between different claims? In this case, Dave will testify against Henry, and Henry will not testify against Dave. How can you, from those basic building blocks, find proximity between them to then realize, actually these two, on top of that, are so closely tied together in terms of the conclusion, which is blah, 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 that they will receive a different sentence, that actually this should be an, multi-premise argument. So that's where this term proximity comes in.
Yeah.
So proximity can be measured in terms of whether or not these claims point to each other when pointing to an argument towards the same conclusion, and the number of people that agree on that.
I'd like to have a visual of this, but it seems to me the proximity will be extremely hard to measure. I don't disagree. This works. I said it couldn't work, and you did it, and congrats. It seems that proximity will be hard to measure because in one case, the claim is used directly to the conclusion. In another, it's used on the argument. So you have a meta argument. So comparing, I'd like to see the diagram and seeing, okay, how would I measure that proximity? Now, but what I'm realizing now is you've used 4 arguments plus a claim about proximity, 4 claims, sorry, plus a claim about proximity, 4 arguments really, plus a claim about proximity. So you've used 5 arguments to model 1 row in the truth table.
You could say once you introduce a multi-premise argument, yes, there's a claim entailed into that, like saying these claims are proximate, but you do the same without having the underlying micro-arguments. What this offers is basically basic building blocks upon which you can disagree or agree with that proximity.
Yeah, I won't disagree anymore that this is equivalent, but the way a Turing equivalent is equivalent to Python, and I'll never use a Turing machine. But that's me.
Would it, and this may not be where you're at right now, but I just thought it might be interesting to put the truth table in this document or in another document. And maybe have that in our examples going forward, just as one visualization. Stephen, if you make this visual, would there be multiple ways of doing it, and thus it leads down one path, or is it pretty simple that the
He's putting the 2 ways in parallel? So as I said,
yeah. One thing that I discovered by continuing on this, and that's why it comes lower here.
Mm-hmm.
Blah, 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 blah. So I'm not saying, because Marc-Antoine said that I succeeded, but I did not succeed in exactly the original question that was asked.
No, this is a success.
What I identified is that these underlying 4 micro-arguments need to be true if you want to construct that where did I write it? This multi-premise argument. Here, because expressing agreement with an multi-premise argument necessarily implies agreeing with the proximity of the set of claims used therein, and hence agreeing with micro-arguments. That's the composition. The composition is not that the entire multi-premise argument is constructed out of these micro-arguments. It is, if you agree with multi-premise argument, you have to agree with all the underlying micro-arguments. You cannot agree with the superset, so to speak, and disagree with the underlying micro-arguments.
With
That's
the outer
relation.
ones, that is.
No, all four of them.
No, because I disagree with the micro argument one in its pure form. I don't think that's true. I think that micro one about micro two is true, but I don't think micro is true on its own. Just as I don't believe that Socrates is a man proves Socrates is mortal on its own. I think that on its own is false. In the full form, it's true.
Yeah, but that's semantics of what to support means.
No.
So the way I look at supports is not that in and of itself, that's, you can draw the conclusion from that. It's the more open, informal way. Yes, it contributes to, and actually we can go to the CDL glossary, how I wrote it there.
Okay. Oh, that's a highly unintuitive notion of agree with.
It's more informal.
No, it's not more informal. I would never use it in that sense. Maybe because I'm a formal thinker, but I don't think so. It's like, would you
Well,
agree?
is agreement the right word? Because he was using supports. Those are different things.
In the CDL, can you see this
Well, I don't
browser
think
window? It
supports
might
is
be a
a-
different one.
I don't think supports makes intuitive sense in that, if that's what it means.
No, I don't. I think we only see. I think we're only seeing one.
I copied it.
Okay.
So an argument, a micro-argument, is a claim, can support or oppose another claim, thereby strengthening or weakening. It doesn't say that that it necessarily concludes. It means strengthening or weakening.
No, that's fair. And I agree. What I'm saying is that, okay, we put it in the glossary and I'll stand by it. You're making an argument about what is the most intuitive way to model things. And I'm saying this notion of support is sound, but very formal and unintuitive. And if you're using that as a building block, I'm arguing that what you've come up with is unintuitive. I mean, here, I'm not saying you're wrong. Clearly, what you've done is right, but we're arguing about relative intuitiveness of different constructs here. You're saying it's simpler because it's a single argument, and it's simpler to build the multi-premise out of single premise. And I'm saying, well, it requires using this notion of support, which I argue is not intuitive at all. To me,
look at this structure. Let's go up a little bit higher. What is the conclusion they are supporting? Is that they will get a different sentence, right? So right there, you're missing a very important hidden premise, which is, and the sentence structure is a prisoner's dilemma, right? It's totally missing from the structure. So this would be something somebody might want to argue against, saying, oh, you know, actually, we're not using the prisoner's dilemma here to decide sentences. Where would you put that? This is the place where you would have to put in a new premise, and where would you do that?
Well, that's where we go to the truth table, and I think that's my next point. I need to scroll down to show that and not up.
I'd like to make another point first, and it's something that does bother me. It's that sometimes I will want to say that an argument supports another, which is not a way to introduce another premise. I think there's two very distinct cases. There's introducing a new premise, which is what you're doing, which is one, you're trying to introduce a new premise with support. But I'm saying sometimes a claim can...
I dropped out.
Oh.
I can hear Marc-Antoine fine.
Yeah, I can hear Mark.
Okay.
I can hear both of you.
Okay,
Yeah,
so but I'll still repeat. Sorry. I'm saying there's two ways, like what you're doing is you're using...
I think Stephen froze.
I'm back.
You're back, okay, good. You're using the notion of an argument supporting another argument. And I'm saying to introduce a new premise. And I'm saying introducing a new premise is a distinct operation than a very different case where a claim supports an argument structure. I'm saying prisoner, let's take the Socrates argument, or I could use this one, but this argument works because modus ponens on Barbara is sound. This is not a new premise. This is, I'm saying this argument is well formed.
I agree, they are distinct. That's the difference between it being necessary for the conclusion to be true and it only like, yeah.
Increasing the probability.
Exactly. I think at least that's what you're saying.
What I'm saying, no, it's not what I'm saying. It's not
You're
about
even saying whether the argument structure holds, yeah. But then again, that implies that you need to support different types of argument structure, and then that is entailed within your argument itself. Whereas all of this leaves that open by this very loose informal word support.
Yeah.
And this is heading in the direction, if you want to add more formalization, you build that on top of this. This is the informal basic building blocks. If you want more formalisms, then you go to multi-premise arguments, for example, in which case these imply these underlying micro arguments. And that's what I wrote here. Like you cannot get away with that. Once you have this additional logic, like a simple AND operator, you need additional constructs over this micro argument. So that's where I was wrong. You cannot just automatically do it out of micro arguments. You will need more. And I'm now thinking more of supporting multi-premise arguments in that sense. But I still think it's fairly important to have these underlying building blocks linked to them.
As I said, for me, the underlying building block is more the partial function.
Yes, and I think that's where we're ending up at. Like, where do we model this logic, right? So you want to make it a more basic building block. I think if I understand Tim correctly, and if I understand the original intent of multi-premise claims correctly, Tim wants to model it as a specific type of claim. That's number one here. Number 1B, at least.
Your basic objection is for you multi-premise is formal. And it's true that many examples I've given of multi-premise claims are highly formal. But let's what I'm saying is if we do the exercise of saying, and where I do agree with you is there may be a divide between formal and informal, but I'm totally not slicing it the way you do. Because
sorry, my objection is not that it's formal. My objection is that you need informal building blocks.
Yes, but what I'm saying is okay. Well, right now you seem to admit that maybe the informal building blocks don't add up to the full formal system, and we need to have layers, and we need to have a formal layer distinct from the built from informal layer. And I think that's not a bad conclusion, but I would still argue for carving out the informal as not about single versus multi-premise, but about functions versus one row at a time. Because if you think of one row at a time, which I think is what a lot of people are doing informally, actually, they're saying if this and not that, then this, and they don't go into, but if this and that, and if this and that, not that, and if not this and not that. They don't go filling the table. They just say, in this case, with this true, this false, this true, this false, outcome. And I think that's a pretty fundamental building block. And actually, we were having that conversation yesterday, last week with Jamie, where we basically she was saying, is there a function, or is there like, what is it when it's they're all necessary, for example, all conditions are necessary, which is the intuitive first game that came to us from formal logic. I'll agree with that. And I said, yes, in that case, you have a simple function to calculate the rows. And maybe that's where formal logic comes in. When there's a simple function for all that explains all the rows. And that's formal logic. Informal is just putting rows together. There may be holes, doesn't matter. It's just reasoning case by case. But I do think that combinations of situation is part of everybody's intuitive notion of what a case is, and is a pretty fundamental building block in the human mind. Saying this and that happened, sure. There's nothing intuitive about single premise claims to me. It's that simple. But I do think you're on to something, that there is something between intuitive and formal. And for me, it's about saying, do those, adding all those rows together, can it be subsumed in a simple function? And that's a real question. Maybe yes, maybe not.
Let me, this is a half-baked thought. I think when most people argue, like let's say about climate change, they're going to just throw out one or two arguments that, and none of them are necessary. They're all just adding the probability to it. If I made the claim that that's how most people think, does that change your argument, Marc-Antoine, or are you just saying that's them doing half of it and we can, the half about them being
what I'm saying is, if you, I'm contesting your claim. I'm saying, yes, people do that, it's true, but the next step, the immediate next step, which is as intuitive as the first, is me saying, okay, you're saying A causes B, but you know, you're really presupposing C, and actually if C is not true, A does not cause B. So I'm already introducing A and not C does not cause B. I'm already going to two argument form instantly, and that's as intuitive as it gets. But adding a new premise is a fundamental building block. That's what I'm saying.
But how does that first step happen? Do you just have a blank for the other premises?
You're starting, as I said, you're actually starting with a unary function, and then I'm actually mapping the unary function to one row of a binary function, yeah. Blah, blah, blah. But if you don't think in functions, because let's admit that functions are the realm of formal logic, and let's just think informally. And I'll go Stephen's direction there. I'm saying your A implies B is false. It is actually replaced by A and C implies B, but A and not C implies B, so you cannot say that A implies B is false. And that's why I'm saying I refuse your claim because I'm including a new condition. And I'm doing two rows to do it. I'm admitting your A implies B was true in the C is true case, but it's false in the C is false in this.
But that's, I think, the main thing where we still disagree. So you're arguing both that I can't even fully follow. You're arguing both that the conclusion is true and false?
I'm saying that the conclusion depends on the new premise also. If you say, okay, let's go back to Socrates. You're saying Socrates is a man, hence Socrates is mortal. And I'm saying, well, that would be true if all men were mortal. But if all men were not mortal, then you cannot say that. So your original argument is not true in general. It's wrong because it's missing a premise. And I'm saying that is as intuitive as it gets. And I've transformed your unary function into a binary function. I'm saying it's less valid. I'm making a further argument that your unary function is less valid than my binary function. And I've given two rows out of the binary function because I have not considered the cases where Socrates is not a man.
But what happens in a typical conversation? Isn't it just that they would add like an opposing claim to the existing arguments or to the relevant?
But I'm saying exactly, and the opposing claim is precisely making it a two-premise argument.
Well, it might also just weaken it. That's the whole thing. Like how?
All right.
So you're claiming it's equivalent to, right, Marc-Antoine?
No, I'm saying it is. I'm saying it's, okay, I'm not saying there are no other forms of counter-arguments, but I'm saying 90% of rebuttals are introducing a new premise.
Yeah, well, right. I'm just thinking that the way canonical debate used to handle that in the data model is more what Stephen's saying, to where you have you have a claim and you have another claim underneath it, and that claim's attacking it. And then someone attacks the argument and says it's not relevant because not all men are mortal.
And I'm saying that's introducing a new premise. You've built a
Yeah.
multi-premise
Yeah.
argument in doing so.
Yes. Yeah. I just never really saw it that way. So but to my mind, we just came to 2 or maybe 3 different ways of representing that data, and whether we call it a function or call it, do we need to argue about the actual representation now so
no,
we can get down specifics?
I'm making a point. I'm making a point beyond
something?
representation. I'm saying if you don't do that and use the support thing, you cannot model differently the other important case where I'm saying this argument doesn't hold because it's badly formed. It's not because you were missing a premise, you had the right number of premise, but your argument was badly formed. And in that case, I'm opposing, not from introducing a premise, but from attacking the substance of the argument, which is a different case.
It's not formalized, the difference. You can, but it's not formalized. You're totally right there. If you want to formalize it more, you have to do more. We agreed there. If you want to disambiguate between attacking either the argument form or just the relevance, or whether or not it's a multi-premise argument, those are different cases. I guess what I'm suggesting here is that what they all have in common is that they all support or oppose the argument in some sense. And yes, there are more distinct forms which can be formalized more on top of that. And the disagreement there would be that I think it makes it harder for the user and it makes it less canonical, as was also discussed during last week's meeting. Because the building blocks become bigger, all of a sudden you need to fill in multiple claims and you need to say, I disagree with that specific argument, which is composed out of 3 claims, which is etc. And I'm going to add a 4th.
I'm actually claiming, and I made this whole argument that your single row in my basic thing was now composed of 5 claims in your model. And I think that's much less, if you're speaking about the size of the model and the complexity of the model, sorry,
I'm not speaking about the size. The size will necessarily be larger because you compose out of smaller building blocks, even additional stuff that you want to start out with in the beginning. I'm not talking about size, I'm talking about canonicality.
And I'm also speaking about canonicality. And I think you are like already the reason you have 5 arguments is that you have 2 equivalent representations, and then you have further to say that they're equivalent. So you've actually introduced non-canonicality in that equivalent claims are made in 2 forms, and then you further have to equate them. So that's actually much less canonical.
No, that's less formalized. It's still canonical in one place. The problem is, what is less canonical is if you only allow to have the multi-premise argument forms, then you will have, or you might have, and that's what I'm afraid of, you might have 10 different versions that get added of the arguments. Like how do you make them converge to one canonical form?
Okay, that's a valid question.
But before you continue, what I suggest here is you can make them converge through the more canonical building blocks people can agree on, which is a measure of proximity over time.
No, I think you really need to look what it would look like. So what you're saying is, if I'm adding 10 different premises one at a time, right? And then basically we want them to converge to a ternary function, right?
Also, some of those 10 premises might actually be part of one multi-premise argument. Yes, that's the problem.
Absolutely true. And then we've introduced one at a time, and then how do we go from there? Hi, Felix. How do we go from there to a ternary function? And what I'm saying is you really need to look at how this would look in your scheme, because what you'll have is each of those will be a different thing. I mean, as I said, it is equivalent. I'm saying it's much harder to do it your way, but it is equivalent. I'm not saying it won't work, but look at the number of claims you will have to manipulate. It will be totally unwieldy.
But manipulate in which case? When it depends
when
on the use case.
When you want to show that to converge. Precisely.
But
You say
what?
it will be hard for me to converge. I'm saying it will be harder for you to converge. So
The underlying micro arguments will always stay there. They won't be removed. So if anyone ever at some point disagrees,
same for me.
Yeah. So if anyone ever,
what I'm saying is, okay, let's say you have 10 arguments, right? They're introduced one at a time. So I have 10 unary arguments, and any pyramid from that pairs them, you know, let's say there's 16 actually, and pairs them in a pyramid, and then you have one. I agree that the pyramid is not canonical because in theory, you could pair them differently. But I'm saying the apex is canonical. And that's what matters. Whereas in your case, you'll probably have to realize all the combinations to get at the apex.
Mm-hmm. Would they
and
always
I'm saying
be
that's
pairs?
ridiculously unwieldy.
You can't do 3 or 4.
No, you can, but then all of them, then the extension would be that there's like multiple underlying here.
So do you realize the combinatorics you're introducing into the system? Think about it.
Well, it's not a
It is. Because you have to look at all combinations to reach the apex in your case. Unlike me.
But you also need to look at all I don't really see the difference. So what do you mean by look at all the combinations? So yeah, you'll need to see like which ones belong together, right?
Well, I'm saying they all potentially belong together. A against B, A against C. I mean, I don't want to enumerate a 16 item combinatorics arrangement, but you know.
Would it be better if we drew these out?
I'm not drawing a 16 element, but let's do it with
well, if Steve can draw his, you could both have 16. You can draw 16 circles. He can draw 70.
But
I don't think we need to resolve which one is easier or not now, as long as we understand.
What I'm saying is your model's less is less wieldy, and I disagree that it's more intuitive. So I'm really trying to see, it is Turing equivalent, but as I said, Turing machine is equivalent to Python. I'll never program anything in a Turing machine. I'm arguing this is a Turing machine. I fail to see a single gain. Because for me, single argument is not a gain, it's a loss. It makes it less intuitive.
Do you want to think about that some, Stephen? And we can move on to another topic.
I have a question for Marc Antoine.
Go for it.
Which is the other part, like when you're doing micro arguments, right? And you're doing one adding a supports and adding a supports and adding a supports. Each extra supports, each premise that you add, you can argue against or against whether it's necessary at the point where it's supporting the other one, right? Where would you put it in the other structure?
I would, okay, when I'm introducing the binary, the multi-premise binary argument, and let's say I'll do it a row at a time because I do think that's a good idea and more intuitive. I would say this two-function argument is more complete than the single function argument. And this is itself a claim. And this is where I introduce that attack. I'm saying the two.
How do you see that actually? What would be the UI for that? Is it a table you're editing and you add a new column, or how should we envision this?
This is where I do agree with you, Stephen, is that what will probably happen most of the time is we'll have a UI where we will say there's a premise missing, and the UI will be introduce a new premise. But I'm saying at the model and how it will be shown as a result is saying there should be a link. Yeah, I think I would show the single premise and the two premise and saying the one premise is attacked on the ground of being less complete than this one, or of not taking into account the case in the attacking row. Like basically if I'm saying let's go back to A and B. You say A implies B, and I'm saying no, A and B implies C, but A and not B implies not C.
So you would introduce new arguments by pointing them. Is that like opposing, or is that a new structure that you formalize, or like you say that the way to improve an argument is by pointing to another argument, one other argument, and say this one is better.
So what I would have, I should write it actually on the. May I write on the same Google Doc so we have it?
Because that's a structure we also haven't discussed in the glossary yet, right? So that's another type of formalization than like supports or opposes, I presume, or.
So let me can I write? Oh.
I just take over the screen, I would say.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, I think that's easier. Share screen.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, good. And this one, by the way, is almost optional, the number 2.
Yeah, number 3 is also negation. We said I also just claim, so it's just a matter of picking the correct claim, right? So there's no real distinction between 2 and 3.
So this is what I would have, and 2 is optional. I mean, this might be conceding, yeah, it's true and C is true, but when not C, it goes against V. And 3 opposes 1. That's really important. I'm saying this argument opposes this argument. I have a meta argument here. So when I'm saying not that claim as in and of itself is not true in abstracto, because in the case when C is false, we don't have B despite having A. Hence, this statement opposes that this statement can stand on its own. And that's what I'm calling the structure of the basic counterargument. You're saying A supports B, and I'm saying, well, when C is false, even if A is true, we still don't have B. So I'm opposing your basic statement. So
now to come back to canonicality,
yes.
How do you see the scale over time? Like then somebody else comes in with D, etc., E, F, G, 16 different ones.
Exactly. That's perfect. Well, if suppose that they introduce D independently, and then we'll do the dependent case. So somebody says E, A, and not D opposes B, and same structure, 5 opposes 1. And then in terms, what I may do at any point is combine these things and say A and, for example, not D or not B, or I could do it row by row. I could say A and, but I may not even need to do that really. The question, okay, I will only need to do that if I want to give us another case. If I want to say A and, because this is fine as it is. I could go and say A and not D, not C, or not D opposes B, but that's logic. And that's where you said this is formal. And I even agree, this is formal. What will really happen is most of the time, this is fine. It can live as such. And if somebody disagrees with me, they might introduce, oh, look, A and, for example, not D and not B supports B. And 7, no, 8, 7 opposes 5, and 5 or 6, I'm not sure, opposes 3, but they do oppose 5 and 3. I guess maybe by extension. So that's a new case. They're saying, yeah, but maybe there's an XOR here, right?
So
And
I would argue if you keep going on this, you won't have canonical information on how these pieces of all the separate claims being A, B, C, and D, how they relate.
I'm saying, why not? Okay, if you're saying this is not equivalent to the full function, I agree totally. This is not equivalent to the full function. But we already said full function belongs to formal domain, and in informal domain, people reason by cases. And I do believe we should have the formal domain. But I don't think that's what
I'm
you're
saying. I'm
Okay.
saying that it's easier to be canonical on which bits and pieces of information are relevant in a certain context to a certain degree, as opposed to fully formalizing the logic within it as a basic building block. It's easier to have canonical agreement on, oh, these pieces of information, they are relevant when we're talking about this, than to say A and not D and not B, and then you can introduce another one that attacks all of the other 4 ones, etc. You're going to have a highly complicated
let's do this much with 4 ones with yours, okay? Because I think it's worth doing it. Okay, so in your model, we have A supports B. Let's do it. 2, you're saying
C supports B.
C opposes.
No, supports B.
But that's not equivalent to what I'm saying. It should oppose B.
You're saying not C.
Oh, no, you're right. C supports B. Okay, no, you're right. Sorry. C supports B. Okay, cool. And then?
You also seem to say that not C opposes B, so you can also add that.
All of these I consider false, but go on.
Incomplete, right? Is what you mean? They're false because it's incomplete.
For me, incomplete, not true in all cases means false.
Yes. So if you want to say why it's not true in all cases, then you can add the other arguments supporting 1, 2, and 3, right? So you can say, for example, underneath 1, you can add, what is it?
Okay.
C supports 1.
C supports 1, okay. And not C opposes 1. Right?
I'm not certain about that one. It might also depend on a concrete example. I can't really tell here.
Oh, I think it's, if you don't have this, I have no reason to suppose that this is true. Because maybe not C opposes B only when A is false, for all I know.
No, right? I think you're right. Yeah, I think that's correct. So C seems to be a fundamental disagreement here, which is also nice. You can see that like at that point because both will be added. Where are we then? At 5, right?
Oh, well, if I follow your scheme, I would also have to have A supports 2, and is that all? Do I need not A? No, I don't need not A.
They might, and that's when indeed the let's call it proximity. I kind of like that word. That's when you'll notice a proximity between them. Yeah.
And then, okay, and then 7 is proximate to 4. So that's another statement.
Sorry, no. That's not what I said. Right now, all we have are micro arguments.
Yes.
So this is what I call more user-friendly way of slowly getting towards multi-premise arguments. If you keep adding these, and just by looking at it, you can see it It's actually less
Okay, no,
complex.
but I want to continue the exercise. This is just the beginning.
So what do you want to do now then?
Well, introduce C and D. I want to show just how many ridiculous number of arguments will get generated, A. And I want to show that it's not that clear what, not that clear what is said with those. So you have to go through the whole thing.
Just to mention, we're at an hour. This is a very fruitful conversation, so we can keep going as long as people are willing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not.
I think what you're hinting at is you're at some point you realize you actually want to add a multi-premise argument, correct? So as
Yes.
of now, there's no multi-premise arguments yet. There's only the canonical building blocks upon which they might be built.
And I'm saying it's less clear to understand that than understands this. I'm saying that is less intuitive than this. I'm very much saying that than these two, to be exact.
But I mean, it's a bit of a weird thing to say since we're not in a user interface right now.
Well, you did ask me, how would I show this? I would actually show the link from this to this to this. So maybe I should ask you how you will show this. But now, to be absolutely honest, I need to do it properly. So D supports B, not D opposes C. D supports 1, not D opposes, no, not D supports 1, not D opposes 1. And A supports 20, 20, oh, that's 8. Sit.
So all of these will, I'm not going to verify them, but all of these will be there indeed if you want to construct them as multi-premise arguments. The point is that you would only do that, again, it's a notion of incremental formalization, if you want to formalize that these two do belong together and you want to embed the logic of that and that results in that.
Now, what I'm trying to show is a bit different. I'm trying to show that there's ambiguity in that representation.
There is. That's what's more informal about it. It's ambiguous in the sense that it's informal. It's up to the user to interpret. If you want to formalize more, that's why we disagree. You want to formalize more initially. I'm saying we can formalize on top of less formal building blocks.
And I'm
with the added benefit that through those less formal building blocks, you can actually contest the more formal building blocks. It's the same mechanism you use to say, oh, this is actually not a multi-premise argument because the proximity between these claims is non-existent. I don't agree with that proximity. You have a measure of that now, whereas you don't have that measure with the first list you have, URML you started out with. You can only say, well, I'm going to construct a new argument and contest, well, one or all of the other existing ones that are already out there. That's what I call less canonical.
I don't see why it's less canonical, seriously. I do think that imprecision, of course, how should I put it? The question is, how much information are we willing to lose by being less precise? Like, for example, my distinction between formal and informal is that the informal, as I've defined it, is more wordy than the informal. The formal is more economical. For you, it's almost the reverse. No, it's not the reverse, but no, it's true in both our case. The informal is more wordy than the formal.
It's a contradiction that Tim reiterated on as well. Not a contradiction, I would say. There's a conflict that needs to be resolved between being too formal and having a lot of disagreement lead to entirely new structures, as opposed to being less formal and being able to agree on more basic building blocks. I think that's really where it lies. But Felix, you wanted to comment on something?
Yeah, I just want to see if I understand correctly. So the bottom part is basically showing the whole truth table, but in an incomplete way. Missing lines in the truth table, or? Okay.
First, we agreed that we don't need to fill the whole truth table at one time. I think we're all agreed on that. So we're all doing, okay, how do we define a multi-argument truth table? And I'm saying, let's just do the whole row. And if we're comparing more premise with less premise, well, we just say this this premise is important, and hence the partial premise is insufficient. So that's what I'm trying to argue. What Uris is trying to argue is we can build the multi-premise argument from single premise arguments by having the new premise, because of course the new premises exist, oppose the single premise argument itself. And if there's a three premise argument, then it will oppose that, and so on. And that means for me, it introduces path dependence, and it's hence less canonical. We're arguing over that. But he's basically saying build a single premise from higher order, the multi-premise from higher order single premise. I'm opposed, and he's claiming it's more intuitive. I'm saying it's less intuitive.
It's still a new construct. It's still a new formalization, multi-premise argument. But what I'm saying is it entails that you agree with all of the underlying micro-arguments, and you can even when you introduce from a user interface a more formal multi-premise argument, you can automatically create all of the underlying micro-arguments. And as a user, when you agree with a multi-premise argument, you can automatically translate that agreement to all of the underlying micro-arguments.
And this is something, if you say agree instead of support, total disagreement, because I don't agree with a single premise argument. I might admit that they kind of support something, but I disagree with them.
That's the semantics I'm using here. I'm not saying that it's a complete argument in any way. And again, that's also where we disagree so much. You want to have this complete argument, and
for me, the incomplete argument is false. I mean, for me, this is exactly what a rebuttal is. I'm saying your argument is false because it's incomplete. I disagree because it's incomplete.
Any argument we already agreed as well is always incomplete because you can always pull in additional.
But for me, that's the meaning of disagreement.
Can I try to tie this into how this has been working in practice? Because it might help ground a little bit. Like when we start getting theoretical, we start kind of wanting the perfect absolute solution. And I see that, but I don't know if we need all that. So here's the way it works, like in debate map and in Gruff. Debate map does it as multi-premise arguments. Gruff does it as multi-premise claims, right? Which is sort of your A and B as a single claim unit of truth. They both handle this the same way though, which is like a normal thing would be, okay, somebody says Socrates is a man, right? To prove that Socrates is mortal, right? Somebody, as you said, wants to argue against that, and what do? They don't like create these intermediary objects or anything. So a normal person will come in and argue against the Socrates is a man argument, attacking the relevance of it by saying, yeah, but not all men are mortal, right? So what you have is an argument that is Socrates is a man, and then an argument against that relevance, which is attacking the argument rather than the base claim, saying that not all men are mortal. That is how people will use the system in most cases.
That's absolutely
right?
True.
Okay, and keeping that in mind, now what you've done is introduced a premise, and you can see somebody then supporting or opposing that, and so on and so forth. What you've got is something that works for the end user. Where doesn't it work? That's when in my opinion, when we get into scoring, it might have a little to do with being canonical and that sort of thing. It might just have to do with readability. There's a lot of reasons why you might want to organize that better. And the way that works in debate map and Gruff is exactly the curation action, which is somebody else coming in and saying, well, let's organize this a little better, right? Okay, no, this is really like a multi-premise claim because, it's a syllogism. In this case, you actually have to have both in order to prove the final thing. So I'm going to wipe out that previous structure. And by wiping out, I mean, like you can see it in history, but anybody who comes to the debate isn't going to see those other things floating around, right? Because it's messy for the average person to have to see that. And what they'll come and see is, after curation, somebody having done Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, with an argument against that all men are mortal thing, supports Socrates is a man, is mortal, right? And I think that's the majority of cases, and in my opinion, is good enough. You know, I don't know how that would fit into your view of having all these multiplying forms. I do see how it fits in, but I think what we need to keep in mind is that more important than handling all these complexities as they grow infinitely big is handling a way to essentially clean it up so it never becomes the mega problem we're talking about.
And just
Tim, were you addressing Marc-Antoine or me in that last question?
Both of you.
Well,
you know, the question of...
I can quickly answer. I fully agree with what you said. That's also why I prefer in these basic building blocks. And indeed, at some point, you need curation, you need to clean it up. But that's a UX thing, in my opinion. If you introduce a multi-premise argument through curation, either because you've figured out this proximity, as I described in the Google Docs document, or somebody decides to do it manually, you just hide all the underlying building blocks, but they're still composed of them. You just hide them and no longer show them. If you do object with the multi-premise argument, you can still decide to dig in, open it up again, show them again, and contest exactly which of the specific claims does not support the other argument, etc. That's what I'm suggesting. So I think it's very much in line with what you say.
And I must say, I also saw what Tim described as close to what I was seeing, because you're saying don't introduce unnecessary intermediate objects, and it seems to me that Stephen's solution introduces a slew of them. So that's my vision of what's happened.
Right. What we want is a normal person to be able to argue something like, you know, they're going to get the different.
And I agree totally with the fact that the process is as you describe, but I'm still saying that what they're doing at a fundamental level is introducing a multi-argument proposal. Because, and again, we need to distinguish this. Are they saying Socrates is not mortal because not all men are mortal? Or at least we cannot argue that Socrates is immortal from Socrates being a man because blah, blah, blah. That's one case. And the other case is, I disagree that Socrates is a man, or I disagree that your premise is at all relevant. It's another case. And I certainly believe in not erasing those cases. If they think the original premise is totally irrelevant, we want to know that. And so knowing which premise.
Right. So the way that, yeah, and the way that the current systems deal with it is by not dealing with it, right? They don't sit around, which is, you know, perhaps wrong, is a bad thing. You know, if there's a version that has extra unnecessary premises.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, if the disagreement is on which premises are relevant, can we express that? I think that's
right. That's what I'm saying. Well, you can express it because in the crudest fashion, you know, if I say, you know, all men are mortal and Socrates is a man and rabbits are white, right? Okay.
Okay.
What you no. So what you have in a situation like this is people can argue against rabbits are white. Not all rabbits are white, and that's destroyed the whole argument, even though it's just because there's a spurious argument in there. Somebody could place an argument. Remember, you have these three premises. Supports Socrates is mortal, right? So somebody can argue against that collection of three at the supports part of this, which is it doesn't support it at all because those three premises are not, they don't conclude, they don't necessarily conclude. So there's a place to do it. In that case, the solution would be introducing a competing one, right?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's what I'm talking about, though it may be. I'm honestly trying to see the. What I'm trying to say is, suppose I say Socrates is mortal because Socrates is a man. Someone may say, well, that's only true if it's also established that all men are mortal. So what they're saying is, if your premise plus my premise are true, then yes, you can draw this conclusion. But if your premise is true and my premise is wrong, then you cannot.
But okay, but in that case...
That's one case. That's case one. Let me go through the two cases so we can distinguish them.
But that's really not how people argue, Marc-Antoine. That's the whole point. They either believe all men are mortal or not. And depending on that, they will make an argument.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, but not all men are mortal. That's where they'd argue, is against
I agree that
the truth of the underlying premise in that case.
Yes, but I'm saying there's two sub-cases in there. I agree that's what they'll say. That's not the issue. The issue is it can mean two very different things. And one of them is they think the Socrates is a man condition is insufficient, or they could mean that the Socrates is a man condition is irrelevant. Those are two different cases.
Does your system force them to make that decision at the time of data entry? So I think that would be the contention. That's not informal then.
No, I don't think it's a contention. I think we agree. And the question is, how do you formalize that? And I actually think it would be a good exercise for Marc-Antoine to sketch like a UI mock-up thing, not the data structure, but like more from a user interface perspective. How would you see that happening?
That's fair.
But then maybe I misunderstood. So Marc-Antoine, you're saying that someone can enter that without saying which of those two?
You know what? I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
I want to think about this one. Let
me throw out just a claim and see what y'all think. I claim that I think I can translate Marc-Antoine's to Stephen's and Stephen's back to Marc-Antoine's.
I've agreed with that.
And I think the only main difference is that in Stephen's, so for me, the fact that you have more intermediary objects doesn't matter because I'm storing that same data in just two different ways. I guess I was thinking that Stephen's form did not allow for the more compact form of Marc-Antoine's, but you could model Stephen's less compact version in Marc-Antoine's. So if we just wanted to, we're probably not to a decision point now, we should discuss it. But I was just thinking one criteria might be the flexibility of the system, although I think Timothy hates that.
That's what I wanted to ask. Like, are these two isomorphic? That's what Bentley said, right?
Yes and no. They can be, but I'm saying the isomorphism comes at a cost. I do think that in some cases the isomorphism will make the memory explode. I suspect that. I cannot prove it, but I'll try to actually. Well, I cannot prove it yet, off the top of my head.
I think the user interface example would be interesting. I don't think it'll make a decision for me, but yeah.
Yeah, no, but what I will try to, what is clear to me, I said it's isomorphic earlier. I still think it's kind of true, but I do think that
it depends on the specifics of the multi-premise argument formalization, how we define a function, the truth table. We didn't even get there right now, and I don't think we have to.
No, and I'm saying I'm willing to let go functions for now, and just work with rows. Because I'm willing to stay in the informal realm and leave functions to the formal realm. But I do think that the natural expression of both our models will not be trivially equivalent because, not truly isomorphic, because there are things that are implicit in either representation that are not in the other. So if you see what I mean? Like that, if we take the basic user operation and take the natural representation in his and natural representation in mine, the implications won't be the same. Now we could translate them But I'm saying they're not equivalent in the sense that the natural expression of the basic user operation in either system is not equivalent. But we can take my representation translated in terms of his representation, though it's not what will happen from the basic user operation, and vice versa. I hope that's clearer. So that way I don't interpret the user action in the same way. I interpret it differently. And that's why Bentley asked me, would the user have to specify that? Well, if we don't specify that, there's certainly imprecision. And I'm saying, for me, Stephen's model is imprecise because the natural translation of user actions is missing information that I would like to get from the user. Now, can I punt it and say, you know, make the imprecision explicit in my model so that getting more precise can be done later? That's something I want to think about.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
But I do agree that they're logically equivalent at some level. Yes.
That's probably a good place to stop then. We're about 20 minutes over time.
Yes.
But interesting conversation. Appreciate everyone's participation.
And by the way, I mean, sorry, I was extremely hard on you, Stephen, but I do appreciate that you managed to prove me wrong. This can be done.
If anyone can take it, Stephen can. He's used to causing trouble.
But I will think harder about this and make my argument clearer.
A thought that comes to my mind is, I don't know if it's related, but when I worked with Boolean formulas like CNF and DNFs, I always found that DNFs are more intuitive for humans to understand. Does that have something to do with the UX?
Probably does, and it certainly has to do with what I'm now proposing as an informal model. My informal model is a bit like a DNF. Is it? Let me check that actually.
No, more like the truth table is usually more like in DNF, right?
Yeah, the truth table is, let's just check that I'm getting it right because it's been a while since I've done it. This disjunctive normal form is disjunctive at the top or at the bottom? It's at the bottom, right?
What's the question?
Disjunctive normal form is the disjunction at the, yes, that's it. And yeah, that's DNF.
Everything or connected, basically.
Here I have DNF with and connected by R. Yeah.
I think this discussion is only really relevant in terms of functions. If you only consider individual rows, I think you'll get there with AND combinations. Maybe that's a thing you can do instead of the UI as well, is find an example where you need complex single conclusion arguments like that. Because I think then it just boils down to and all of them need to be true.
So I'm coming back. Yes, you are right. What I'm proposing now with row-wise decomposition is equivalent to a DNF. I agree.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, like, if you leave away rows, it's not undefined, right? It's as the same as removing terms in the DNF, basically. It just means it's for the cases that are not defined, it's false, as you mentioned already, Marc-Antoine.
No, I never said, no. For me, for the case where the row is missing, it's undefined. It neither supports nor opposes. As far as we know.
Oh.
It's a partial function.
Okay.
And so that way it's not a pure DNF because it's not a total function.
Okay, right, that's the difference, yeah.
That's the difference. And I do think that's closer to how the mind works. I do think that there's no implicature of falsity when there's a hole in the function.
Yeah, right, it's just undefined, right.
Yes.
Good point.
I do think this DNF of multi-premise function is very intuitive, and we're arguing about what's intuitive here. And I do certainly argue that the basic act of opposition with a new premise, which we agree is fundamental. We all agree on that. The question is what happens when there's more than one opposing premise, and I'm saying it's more natural to model it with increasing arguments on a multi-value function than composing it from one function at a time and doing the pyramid. I'm saying the pyramid should be erased. Let me put it another way. If we do it one new premise at a time, and you know, this is what you were asking me with the exercise. Oh, and then what happens after my two first stages where I've introduced C and D separately? I'm saying, you know, that may be good enough. Maybe there's no new case complexifying this. It's good enough. And that way I agree with you, the one at a time. But it stops being good enough when I'm saying, well, actually, C and D are an XOR relationship, for example. And then expressing that with a multi-premise is just adding a row with the 4 premises.
But an XOR relationship implies that you're making multiple arguments.
The XOR is what I'm telling you as a language shortcut.
Yeah, but that's where the shortcut doesn't really represent reality, because you would never argue for all of the potential outcomes in a Prisoner's dilemma. You would only argue for one.
I absolutely agree with that. What I would do in the real situation, and where I'm not talking to another logician or programmer, is say, oh yeah, but did you notice when A and not B and not C, we still had B. Can't see that. So that goes against both the other assertions. The other assertions, and again, I'm saying the other assertions were incomplete, which is my way of saying I disagree with them because I've thought of a new case that is a counterexample to the rules that was enunciated in the simpler case. So now I'm introducing a four argument case as a way to say, you know what, your 3 argument cases don't represent all cases. But as long as I don't have an XOR, my 2 separate 3 argument functions say enough. And I don't need to create the 4 argument function until I have a case that contradicts what can be inferred from the 3 argument case. And I think that's very general. I'm saying, you know, your 1 argument case is not good enough because counterexample. And I think counterexample is a fundamental human operation. And what's happening in the, you know, this argument opposes this, it's introducing a counterexample. But the counterexample is presumably in presence of the original premise.
But what you're doing is you're trying to derive the function.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I use the function as a way to express the case. I'm saying I'm just introducing cases and showing this case with 1 more premise is a counterexample to your case with less premises. I'm saying that's the fundamental human operation.
Well, if it's so fundamental, I really need to see real live examples of this because I haven't seen them.
I think what Tim explained,
in words,
what Tim explained that you agreed with was the fundamental case. This is exactly what I described.
Yeah, but then sketch it, what that would look like in your model, in your user interactions.
Sure, but it's not different from Tim's description.
No, I understand you can describe it as functions, but you're saying
no, forget functions. I'm not speaking about functions. Am I speaking about functions? I'm not speaking about functions. I'm speaking about saying exactly what Tim described. You know, Socrates is a man implies Socrates is immortal is opposed by not all men are mortal. This is exactly the interaction we're speaking about.
But the interaction on what? That's why I need to see some user interface sketches, because the way you talk about it is still you're interacting on some incomplete function that you want to argue is incomplete.
Why are you asking me that when you didn't ask Tim when he made the exact same description? Sorry,
Because of what is implied, I guess, by, I mean, everyone sees something different in front of them. And I'm somewhat convinced Tim and I see the same thing, other than that he's more keen to instantly jump to multi-premise arguments, and I'm more keen to jump less quickly to multi-premise arguments. But I think we see the same in front of us, whereas I'm still not certain what you're seeing.
Okay, that's fair enough. I'll buy that. But I do say, when you're saying, what's the UX? I'm saying probably the same UX Tim has in mind. But I'm saying the underlying mental operation is introducing a new premise in the situation as a counter argument, assuming the other premise is maintained. Okay, I'll write something about this somehow. Okay, gotta go now.
I do just want to throw in the last thing about the interfaces, which is in practice, I see both approaches where somebody makes a statement and another person introduces a premise later on by arguing against something that wasn't stated. That's common, but the more people get familiar with this kind of debate structure, and specifically curators and people like us who are used to arguing and are trying to fill out an argument, you immediately see ahead of time when you're making an argument all the premises. And so kind of expert users will want to immediately lay out all the premises at the same time, right?
That's so clearly Jamie's fundamental operation is introducing new premises all the time. That's her basic UX use case.
So yeah, I think both should be supported.
All right, so I'm going to stop recording.
Thanks everybody.
Bye everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks everybody. Bye.